A patrol that should have been as ordinary as any other turned into a moment that would change everything for Officer Caleb Hart. The quiet rhythm of his boots along the old train trestle was broken by a sound that didn't belong there. A trembling, muffled whimper that carried up through the fog and steel. When he followed it, his breath caught in his chest. For German shepherds, one mother and her 3 barely weaned pups were bound, blindfolded, and abandoned on the tracks with a freight train screaming toward them. Time seemed to collapse into heartbeats. Caleb moved fast, every instinct sharpened by urgency. His knife cut through rough twine, freeing trembling paws one by one. The horn wailed, the ground shuddered, the headlights bore down. With seconds to spare, he lifted the mother into his arms, called to the pups, and scrambled up the embankment. They tumbled into the grass just as the train tore past in a rush of fire and thunder. Shielding them with his body, Caleb felt the heat and grit sting his skin, the vibration rattle his bones. And then silence. The dogs huddled into him, still shaking, still alive. The mother lifted her muzzle, pressed it against his palm, and gave the faintest lick. Gratitude in its simplest form. He whispered back to her, voice raw, "You're safe now." Through the fog, a figure appeared at the fence line. Mara Duval, broad-shouldered, gray-haired, sharp-eyed from years of tending goats and gardens, watched without a word. She stepped closer with a folded wool blanket in her arms. "You'll want this," she said quietly. He wrapped the shivering pups as the mother leaned against his leg, her body weak but her spirit unbroken. And in the distance, the growl of an unfamiliar rust-colored truck faded into the trees, as if someone had been watching too. By the time Caleb carried them into his cabin, the weight of the day hung heavy in the mist. The dogs curled near the fireplace, exhausted, scarred, but together. He draped them in his mother's quilt, his steady hands smoothing over their trembling forms. Kaya, that name settled on him like it had always belonged to her, never took her eyes off him. Not fearful, just tired, watchful. Her ribs sharp beneath her patchy coat, her scars whispering a history no one had cared enough to stop. He picked up the phone, voice steady but low. "Elise, it's Caleb. I've got a situation. For shepherds. Bad shape. Can you come?" There was no hesitation on the other end. "I'm on my way." Less than an hour later, headlights cut through the fog and Dr. Elise Moreno stepped into the cabin. Her boots still wet with mud. Known in Maple Ridge as the vet who never turned away a call, she knelt immediately by the dogs, her calm presence filling the room. The mother tensed, growled low, but Elise only held out her hand, palm open. Her voice soft as she whispered, "You're safe now, Mama." Kaya sniffed, then stilled. Elise's trained eyes moved over every scar, every old wound layered with fresh. She saw the story written in their skin, in their silence, in the way Kaya shielded her pups even now. And in that moment, Caleb knew. This wasn't just cruelty. Someone had meant for these dogs to disappear, erased as if they never existed. But they hadn't. Not tonight. Elise's hands moved with practiced care, checking ears, paws, teeth. Each detail telling a story darker than the last. "She's 6, maybe 7, Elise murmured, her brow drawn tight. "She's been through hell. These scars, they weren't accidents. Someone did this to her." Caleb's jaw clenched, the weight of anger heavy in his chest. Elise's voice softened but carried an edge. "She's starving too. Whatever she found, she gave to her pups. That's the only reason they're alive." One by one she turned to the puppies. The ash-gray male, smallest of the 3, needed her longest care, his heartbeat fragile beneath her fingers. The golden-coated one, whom she quietly named Willow, had more strength, though hunger still showed in her thin frame. The 3rd, with a sharp black saddle down his back, Scout, stood out, sturdier but just as neglected. Elise shook her head. Severe vitamin deficiency. Scraps, if anything at all. If they'd stayed out there another day, they wouldn't have made it. Before Caleb could reply, a soft knock rattled the cabin door. Mara Duval stepped inside, her arms full of a basket draped in crochet. She placed it on the table, unveiling wool blankets and jars of broth. "I heard Elisa's car," she said, her voice steady as stone. "Thought you could use these." Caleb blinked at the kindness, but Mara cut him off. "I saw what you carried in, and I saw what was prowling before you arrived. Old green pickup, rusted fenders, broken tail light, not local." Elise and Caleb traded a glance, the truth sitting heavy in the air. This hadn't been chance. Someone had left those dogs there on purpose. Mara's eyes softened as she looked at Kaya, her voice low. "This one has more strength than most people I know." Almost on cue, Kaya lifted her head, pressing her muzzle to Caleb's wrist, a slow, deliberate gesture that felt like more than gratitude, felt like trust. Later, after fluids, vitamins, and carefully measured food, the cabin glowed with firelight. Caleb sat cross-legged by the hearth, the pups tucked into his hoodie and lap. The smallest, Ash, nestled against his chest, lulled by the sound of his heart. Willow pawed at his leg, whining for attention, while Scout tugged playfully at his sock before settling loyally at his feet. Caleb let out a low, weary chuckle. "You're going to make this impossible for me," he whispered. But even then, he knew the truth. They had already claimed him. Morning came slow through the mist, Maple Ridge still wrapped in its damp gray shroud. Caleb stepped out of his cruiser, the burlap sack folded under his arm. The gravel lot of Maple Ridge feed supply crunched beneath his boots. The old wooden sign creaked overhead, its paint chipped and faded by years of mountain weather. Inside, the shop was dim, the air thick with hay, dust, and the metallic tang of rusted nails. Behind the counter stood Earl Jennings, his belly stretching against worn suspenders, a red flannel hanging loose over his frame. His beard, streaked gray and yellowed at the tips, framed eyes that narrowed the moment Caleb entered. "You after something, officer?" he rasped, wiping his hands on an oil-stained rag. Caleb laid the sack across the counter, unfolding it with quiet precision. "I'm hoping you can tell me if this came from here." Earl squinted through bifocals, pinching the fabric between his fingers. Inside, faint but unmistakable, was the shop's own mark, a circle with a leaf, Maple Ridge feed supply etched around it. "Well, I'll be," Earl muttered. "Yeah, that's one of ours. Cheap sacks. We sell them by the dozen." Caleb leaned closer. "Anyone buy a batch recently? Maybe last week?" Earl scratched at his temple, brows knitting. "Hard to say. We get ranchers all the time. But, now that you mention it, 3 young fellas came through. Not locals. Scruffy. Paid cash. Didn't talk much." Caleb's eyes sharpened. "Anything stand out?" Earl nodded slowly. "One of 'em had a tattoo. Big letters right here." He tapped his forearm. Said Crowder. The name landed heavy, and Caleb knew exactly what it meant. The name Crowder hit Caleb like a jolt of cold iron. It wasn't just a family name, it was a warning. Their reputation was carved into every lawman's memory. Years of poaching charges, illegal hunts, and a shadow that hung over them darker than anything on paper. Rumors of a dogfighting ring had swirled but never stuck, buried beneath threats and silence. They lived tucked deep in the pines where radios went dead, where even seasoned deputies thought twice before driving in without backup. Caleb thanked Earl and stepped back into the gray morning, the fog hugging the town like a secret. His mind raced, but when his truck rolled back into his drive, everything slowed. Kaya was there, standing at the cabin door, her scarred frame tense, one ear cocked and the other twisted down. She didn't bark, just stared at the road as if she knew it was keeping something from her. The pups barreled out clumsily behind her, Scout lunging for his shoelace, Willow brushing shyly against his leg, and Ash hanging back, studying Caleb with wide, thoughtful eyes. He knelt, letting them climb into his lap, murmuring praise as their small bodies pressed against him. Kaya nudged his hand, but her head whipped suddenly toward the dirt road. A truck rumbled by too fast, leaving nothing but dust. She growled low, every muscle taut. Caleb trusted that growl. Some instincts, he knew, were born of survival. Sleep never came easy that night. He sat at his kitchen table, the burlap sack stretched before him, the word Crowder carved into his thoughts. This wasn't neglect, it was something far darker. The pups slept soundly by the stove, Scout snoring, Willow curled tight, Ash twitching in dreams. But Kaya didn't sleep. She lay at the door, her body a barrier, her eyes unblinking. By morning, the air had changed. The mist clung stubbornly, heavy as stone, and the forest beyond his yard felt like it was holding its breath. Caleb stepped out with coffee in hand, the quiet unsettling. Then he saw it, paper pinned to his fence post with a hunting knife. The blade's handle was wrapped in filthy black tape, sap still wet along its edge. The note was scrawled, jagged, full moons near. Return the 4 or we return for blood. His stomach dropped. Whoever had been close enough to leave that message had been watching. He tore it free, scanning the tree line with one hand on his sidearm. But the woods whispered nothing back. Inside, Scout and Willow wrestled playfully. Ash yipped from the rug, but Kaya was at the door, hackles raised, her growl a vibration low and steady. Caleb whispered, "Yeah, I feel it too." That night he worked methodically, reinforcing every latch, replacing old locks, stringing makeshift alarms. Wires tied to cans and coins that would jingle at the slightest touch. Around the cabin's edges, the forest pressed close, but Caleb knew the paths better than most. It wasn't a fortress, but it would buy him seconds. And in any fight, seconds meant life. Training became part of survival. Scout took to it like a soldier, circling and barking at tossed sticks as if they were intruders. Willow was slower, cautious, but quick to learn once she watched her brother. Ash struggled to keep pace, but his bark was fierce, echoing bigger than his frame. Kaya needed no lessons. She had already taken her post by the windows, ears flicking at every sound, her body drawn tight like a bow ready to release. The next day, Elisa's Subaru pulled into the drive, its tires crunching over gravel. She stepped out, exhaustion written in her face, a long tan coat thrown over her scrubs. When Caleb showed her the note, her silence was heavier than words. Finally, she glanced at Kaya, who sniffed at her boots before sitting close, as if she too wanted Elise to know the truth. Elisa's voice dropped low. "This isn't random. They're watching you." From her satchel, she drew out a hand-stitched collar, deep blue leather with a silver pinecone tag that jingled faintly. She removed the frayed rope from Kaya's neck and replaced it with care. "No animal should carry pain around its throat," she whispered, her hand lingering gently against Kaya's scarred chest. As Elise left, Mara appeared at the path, wrapped in a heavy shawl the color of storm clouds. Her sharp blue eyes missed nothing. She pressed a small linen-wrapped object into Caleb's hands, a bronze handbell, etched with faded flowers, its handle worn smooth with years. "My mother rang this when storms shook the house," Mara said, her voice carrying both steel and tenderness. "Said it called back the courage that tried to run from you. Maybe it will call something else, too." The bell felt heavy in Caleb's palm, not because of its weight, but because of what it meant. Out here, storms weren't always made of weather. Caleb nodded once, the weight of Mara's words settling heavier than the bronze bell she had placed in his hand. That night, the little relic sat by his bed, its soft gleam catching the light of the rising moon. Outside, Kaya refused to rest. She lay with her back pressed to the door, scars silvered under the glow, ears tuned to every whisper of wind. The full moon rose over Maple Ridge, casting the forest in a cold, pale wash of light. Frost gathered on the edges of Caleb's windows, blurring the world outside into a hazy dreamscape. The fire burned low, and though the cabin was warm, tension hung thick in the air. Sleep had been a stranger since the note. Its words echoed like a drumbeat in his chest. Return the 4, or blood. Tonight, the moon was full, and silence carried the promise of something coming. Kaya's frame had grown stronger, her coat thickening, the blue collar at her throat gleaming faintly with its pinecone tag. She twitched at every sound beyond the fence. By the stove, Scout and Willow slept tangled together, while Ash perched near the window, his ears not yet steady but alert to every distant snap of branch or shift of wind. Caleb, dressed in his worn vest, checked his defenses once more. Bells strung on fishing line, one at the gate, another near the shed, a third by the garden, simple measures, but they could buy him a heartbeat. On the counter, Mara's bronze bell waited like a quiet ally. The clock ticked past midnight. Caleb had barely settled into his chair when a sharp clink cut the stillness. The faint chime of brass in the yard. Kaya leapt to her feet, body rigid, eyes locked on the dark beyond the glass. Ash exploded into barks, his puppy voice sharp and frantic. Willow growled low, a rumble in her tiny chest. Scout pressed himself against Caleb's leg, unsure but ready. The floodlight flicked on, drenching the yard in harsh yellow. Shadows stretched long across the trees, and then a figure. A man, lean and crouched, gripping the fence. Hood up, gloves on, face hidden. For a heartbeat he froze under the light, then slipped back to the ground, moving like someone who'd done this before. Kaya's snarl filled the room, deep and guttural. Caleb gripped the doorknob, every muscle ready, but he stopped himself. "Not yet," he whispered. Two more shapes appeared in the tree-line, standing still, silent. They didn't move forward. They didn't speak. They only watched, testing. Then, as quickly as they had come, they vanished into the woods, swallowed by the mist. Caleb's breath came heavy, not from fear, but fury. Whoever these men were, they weren't thrill-seekers. They were deliberate, calculated. By dawn, their tracks had vanished. But Kaya still circled the fence, nose pressed to the ground, her body taut with unease. When she returned to Caleb's side, she leaned against his leg, steady as stone. Later that morning, Elise arrived, her Subaru pulling up with a crunch of gravel. She stepped out wrapped in a navy coat, boots mud-stained, her braid tucked under a wool hat. In her arms she carried supplies, food, medicine, notes scribbled on a clipboard. Over coffee, Caleb recounted the night, his voice clipped. They didn't try to break in, just one scaled part of the fence, watching how the dogs would react. Elisa's brow furrowed, her hands gentle as she examined Ash, who wagged at her touch. Her voice dropped. "That's not random. That's exactly what they do in fighting circuits. They test. They look for barkers, for runners, for the ones who won't fight back." She glanced at Kaya, who sat by the door, her amber eyes unyielding. The way she guards, the way she moves, that's training, not just instinct. Caleb's chest tightened. So this wasn't just cruelty. His voice was low, edged. It was deliberate. It was preparation. Elise stood, brushing fur from her knees, her gaze flicking between the pups and the forest beyond the glass. Whoever the Crowders are tied up with, they're not going to let this go. And Caleb knew she was right. Snow drifted slow and soft against the cabin windows, settling on the roof like a quiet warning. Inside, the air was thick with cedarwood and warmth, steam rising from the copper tub where Caleb crouched with sleeves rolled high. His hands moved carefully through Kaya's sable coat, the German shepherd steady and silent beneath his touch. She wasn't restless this time. No trembling, no fight. Just trust. Then his fingers paused. Something sharp, unnatural beneath her fur. His chest tightened as he parted the scarred hair and revealed a small black disc, no bigger than a coin, sewn into her collar seamed by a thread finer than fishing line. His breath left him in a hard rush. A tracker. Within the hour Elisa's Subaru crunched into the snowy drive, her wool coat dusted white as she carried her leather vet kit inside. One look at Caleb's face and her brows narrowed. "What is it?" He held out the disc with steady hands that betrayed their tremor. "She's been tracked." Elise examined the object under the low lamplight, her jaw tightening. "Not just a tracker. There's a medical chip built in." She pulled out a handheld scanner, the screen flickering green as it read the signal. Project DR9. The name alone stole the air from the room. Elisa's voice dropped. "I've heard of this. A Combat K9 program. Shut down years ago after questionable experiments. Conditioning. Aggression trials. These dogs weren't meant to survive outside the program." Caleb's gaze shifted to Kaya, stretched out by the stove, her amber eyes reflecting the firelight. His voice came out rough. You think she was part of that? Elisa's nod was slow, reluctant. Branded, trained, discarded, or maybe she escaped. Either way, someone doesn't want her out here. The note, the men in the woods, it all began to slot into place like jagged shards. Caleb's jaw set hard. They're not after the pups. They came for her. A log cracked in the stove, sparks rising like embers of truth. Kaya didn't move, but her eyes tracked every step Caleb took as he paced. Every line of his tension mirrored in her quiet watchfulness. She knew. Somehow she knew. Elise crouched beside the dog, fingers brushing the old scar tissue. I can cut the rest of this out, but if they're still tracking the signal, they'll know we found it. Caleb's reply was low, measured. Good. Let them know. The heaviness broke for a moment when Ash stumbled in, oversized ears flopping, a chewed slipper dangling proudly from his mouth. He dropped it at Caleb's feet with a wag that was far too big for his small body. Caleb let out a dry chuckle. Some guard dog you're turning out to be. Elise smiled faintly. They're coming along. Scout's been keeping post on the porch every morning. And Willow. She barked at her reflection yesterday. Caleb's eyes softened as he watched the pups tumble back toward their blanket pile, Kaya rising to nudge them into place before curling protectively beside them. For a fleeting breath, it almost felt like home, like normal. But the storm pressed close, just beyond the treeline. Elisa's voice broke the silence, careful but firm. Let me take her to the clinic. Reinforced kennels, full scans, safety. Caleb shook his head instantly. She won't go. I tried. She freezes in closed spaces now. And I won't force her. Elisa's shoulders fell, but she nodded. Then I'll come here, every day. Whatever she needs, I'll bring it. Gratitude tugged at his chest in a way words couldn't cover. He only managed a quiet, thank you. They stood together, watching the firelight dance across the cabin walls until Elise finally gathered her things. At the door, she hesitated, snow whirling outside. That code on the chip, it's tied to a classified set. If it's still active, someone has access. Someone knows she's alive. Caleb's voice was steady, grim. And if they know she's alive, they know she's here. The door closed behind her, and Kaya lifted her head, a deep growl rolling from her chest. Not fear, but memory, the kind that never leaves. Caleb lowered himself beside her, his hand pressing to her back, steady and sure. In that moment, the line between protector and protected blurred into something unspoken, something stronger. The firelight flickered against the tall pines, painting the clearing in amber and shadow. Caleb sat with the worn blanket around his shoulders, the smoke curling upward into a sky streaked with the last purple threads of twilight. Beside him, Kaya lay close, her muzzle resting against his boot, her new blue collar glinting in the glow. The air was sharp with the smell of pine and wood smoke, but it carried something else too, peace, fragile and unfamiliar after weeks of tension. He watched the flames and thought of the pups, each now curled in a new bed, loved by hands that would guide them into bright futures. Scout, bold and tireless, learning discipline under a deputy's watch. Willow, gentle as falling snow, already tethered to a little girl's quiet heart. And Ash, mischievous and stubborn, bounding into fields that stretched wider than his paws could yet carry him. They were safe. They were home. Ka shifted slightly, pressing closer, her eyes half-lidded but never fully asleep. She was older now, scarred in ways no one could undo, but she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. Caleb leaned forward and stirred the fire, listening to the low crackle, then rested a steady hand on her back. She didn't flinch. She hadn't in days. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, and the forest answered with silence. For the first time, silence wasn't heavy. It wasn't a threat. It was rest. Caleb let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The words leaving him in a whisper meant only for her. We did it, girl. They'll never take this from us again. Kaya's tail flicked once against the dirt, the smallest sign of agreement, and her head lifted to watch the sparks rise into the dark. And in that moment, man and dog sat together in the glow of the fire, bound not by fear or survival, but by something stronger, something that felt like hope. The steam from Caleb's chipped mug curled into the night air, carrying the faint scent of black tea. Ka lay stretched out by his side, her breathing even, her chest rising and falling with a rhythm that finally felt safe. On the table sat a letter, its corners softened by the journey it had taken. The handwriting was delicate, instantly recognizable. It was from Hannah, his sister, the one he hadn't spoken to in far too many years. He unfolded it slowly, his rough hands careful with the fragile paper. The words were hesitant at first, but they warmed with each line. She had heard about Pinewood, about the arrests, about the ring that had been torn down. She had seen the photo on the news, him standing with Ka at his side, worn down but unbroken. You look tired but proud. Maybe it's time we talk again. Come home for Christmas. The kids would love to meet you. And Ka too. A smile touched his face, rare and quiet, as if it had been waiting for this moment. He folded the letter back into his pocket and lifted his gaze toward the stars threading their way across the sky. I'm coming home, Hannah, he whispered. And this time, I'm not coming alone. Ka stirred, lifting her head, and pressed her nose gently against his leg. She would always carry her scars, just as he carried his, but now those scars told a different story. The cabin wasn't just shelter anymore. It was a place of mending. A place where broken lives found a way to piece themselves back together. Sometimes miracles don't roar in with thunder or blinding light. Sometimes they arrive quietly, through the steady eyes of a rescued dog, the warmth of a second chance, the grace of being seen and not abandoned. Ka had every reason to give up on people, but she didn't. And in finding her, Caleb discovered his own redemption. Together they built a home, not just for themselves but for others who needed one too. And that truth still lingers. Healing is possible, love restores, and sometimes God sends his messengers not in wings of white, but in fur and wagging tails. If you've ever felt the touch of that kind of grace, through a loyal companion, through a moment of forgiveness, through the quiet strength of love, hold on to it. Let it remind you that second chances are real. And may your own story, like theirs, be written in loyalty, courage, and hope.